Well, that was exciting. Now you've got everyone looking at their cell phones. The panel takes their seat. We're here this morning to discuss national progress and regional coordination to accelerate the SDGs. And this could be an incredibly boring topic, but I assure you this panel is going to try and ensure that that is not the case. My job, I go around the world, I help countries I'm working with countries to develop their sustainable development roadmaps, these action plans and finance plans to advance the agenda. And one concern I have, and it's been fairly universal so far, is in that dialogue with ministries of finance, with ministries of planning, the private sector has been absent. We've been hosting meetings at country level to develop these action plans. The private sector, well, companies are invited. Rarely do they show up. And until you actually go and interrogate issues with companies and chambers of commerce and so on individually, you're not really seeing their voice reflected in the narrative and in the plans themselves. And I think that is a real concern because we cannot achieve this agenda without companies, without the private sector. We said it yesterday, but I'm going to repeat it. Globally, 60% of GDP is attributed to private companies. It's large, micro, medium, small enterprises, and some 90% of jobs are generated through the private sector. So we're not going to achieve this agenda without companies. And so then the question arises is how in the mechanisms that are being set up globally and at national level, private sector can come to the table and have a voice. Now, of course, the private sector has its own fora. This is one. I think a very important one, and I think as we continue in the journey towards the SDGs, I think has a big role to play in helping to concretize action. But when we have Davos and so on and so forth, and at UNDP we have an initiative called the Business Call to Action, which was set up long before the SDG era in 2005 at the Glen Eagles G8 Summit by Gordon Brown. And this is an alliance with companies who join because they have an interest in serving the needs of people at the bottom of the pyramid. That's people living on less than $10 a day. It's exactly 50% of the world population, people not in the middle class. Now, there is money to be made at the bottom of the pyramid, and one estimate is that something like $5 trillion. So these companies are looking to make a profit by serving people at the bottom of the pyramid, but also to contribute to the better, bigger social good. And we have lots of companies doing really amazing things. Barter Shoes, an iconic brand in this part of the world and in Africa, they have a $1 shoe, and it's made with plastic. They have a buyback scheme, so it's not deposited in the environment. And so it's a great scheme. And here in Singapore, we have Essilor, which is a leading optics company, and they've set up a business unit here with the aim of reaching 50 million low-income people across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So the Business Call to Action, I think, in its current iteration, can play a key role in helping to galvanize action, in this case to deal with bottom of the pyramid issues, and especially SDG 1. So these initiatives are going to be really critical going forward and getting business to take action. Ultimately, companies are going to have to take action at the level of the enterprise, okay? And that action will be driven very much by two things, the profits to be made, as well as the risks from not taking action. So one of the key issues for government is how do they make it possible for companies to invest? That is, to create the policy climate that encourages, if you like, investment and good behavior, but also uncovering risks, if you like. And ultimately, the key issue is to ensure you have a level playing field, so the companies that are trying to do the right thing aren't being outcompeted by cowboys who are not interested at all in the agenda, looking to make a quick buck at the expense of everyone else. Because when you have that situation, and unfortunately that's, we can all agree, far too common across the world, it's a race to the bottom, and I think that's what we're trying to avoid. So we have a great panel this morning. I'll quickly introduce them and then we'll launch into the conversation. Meng is the head of the Asia-Oceania network of the UN Global Compact. Welcome. Adoracion Navarro is the Undersecretary of the Regional Development Office, National Economic and Development Authority in the Philippines. Kamariah Noruddin is the Deputy Director General, Macroeconomic Planning Unit in the Prime Minister's Department in Malaysia. Bhaskar Chatterjee is the Director General and the Chief Executive Officer of the Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs. And Abul Kasem is the President of the Dhaka Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Bangladesh. And Abul, you just arrived yesterday, so is this your first session? Okay, so with that, I'll turn to Meng. You work with the Global Compact, and of course, it's intended to convene businesses to take action for a better future. So what are you doing in the Global Compact, working with companies to advance the Sustainable Development Agenda?
Yeah, thanks, Nick, for this very helpful and informative overview. So the United Nations Global Compact, I'm sure that every panelist here know well, but I'm not sure about all the participants here, that we are the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. And our vision is really to mobilize a global movement of responsible business in support of the SDGs. And as you rightly point out, SDGs consider its complexity that we need really collective, coordinated, and complementary actions from all sectors of society. And as we well represented at the panel, as I look through, that we have representatives from government, from the United Nations, from private sector business, and also civil society organizations / academia. So each of us can play a very important and also complementary role. And at the UN Global Compact, that we are happy to share that with every one of you, that we see increasing number of companies around the world are aligning their business strategies with the SDGs, because it's not only a good thing to do, but also it makes business sense. According to some UN statistics, for instance, I'm very happy to be on such a gender-balanced panel, and if we include women into the formal economy, it will generate, you might want to take a guess, how much of extra GDP of wealth to the global economy. That's $28 trillion. So apparently it makes business sense, and we require business leadership to realize at least 2/3 of the all SDGs. Well, I mean, leadership, it doesn't necessarily imply to that you're doing good only for one SDGs. Well, you are having negative impact on another SDGs. So it means that at the UN Global Compact, we believe we should take a principle-based approach. And we require business to take a leadership and identify, and we provide tools and resources to help them to identify where they can make the most impact. In fact, last week, the UN Secretary General participated in a high-level roundtable organized by the UN Global Compact to have a dialogue with business, where he asked business to take business and Euro to continue to innovate and form partnerships with government to push the climate agenda. So in many aspects of SDGs that we are also very confident, and we are on that journey to lead more business, inspire them, also by individuals. We have, I'm sure that you might know that in our audience, there are several SDG pioneers that was recognized by the UN Secretary General through the UN Global Compact. So also individuals can make an impact on that, and we are on that path to inspire more business and individuals to do that.
But what are you doing more specifically to encourage action? I mean, what are the needs of your members? What are they saying to you in terms of what they expect from the compact in terms of moving the dial?
Yeah, based on our very recent survey, where 2,000 companies that are our participants responded, and the majority of them, over 90% of them, saying they are really working on delivering SDGs. But guess what? Only 13% of them saying they have available tools. So I think at the UN Global Compact, we are trying to translate the SDGs, the 17 goals and the over 160 targets into a language that can be better understood by the business community. So far, we developed 2 guidelines. It's like seen as like an encyclopedia for business to understand how these targets interpret it for them, both refer to the core business and also throughout their supply chains, and what's the existing best practice there for them to refer to inspire them to take similar actions.
So I guess one of the challenges are this is not just going to be win-win-win. There are trade-offs. And the question is, at a national level and at a company level, how do you navigate those trade-offs? So we at UNDP have been working with the mining sector, with the oil and gas sector, working through their industry associations to develop guidance, which is agreed by companies themselves, often at the highest CEO level, in terms of what companies need to do in terms of the actions they might take. And that starts with a mapping, firstly, in terms of the company's contribution to the SDGs, in terms of the actual goods and services that they produce. And for mining, of course, minerals, metals, obviously making a contribution to infrastructure, to cities, and so on. So there's a direct contribution. And then they look at the direct impact of the company, positive and negative, so the creation of jobs, but also impacts such as with oil and gas on climate change. And then they look at the indirect impacts, positive and negative, along their supply chain. So it's quite a complex undertaking. And of course, for the oil and gas industry, where you've got, when you're looking at decarbonization, it's a major issue because it actually speaks to the heart of their business. And so it's interesting that this work at CEO level, companies are now debating, some of the biggest oil companies in the world, in terms of what it's going to take to decarbonize and to move to a future beyond oil, however long that takes. And that starts through a coordinated global approach through the industry associations and a conversation. And each sector needs to do this. So I guess that's where the Global Compact and other initiatives really come into play in terms of helping to galvanize that thinking. Now let's dive down next to what's happening at the country level and turning now to Adoracion, Navarro in the Philippines. Now the Philippines, you've seen really heady economic growth, 6% per year for many years now. And of course, you wouldn't have achieved that without your private sector. And you've sought to improve the ease of doing business, I know. Now moving forward, as you seek to continue your growth story, you need to ensure better equity, and you need to decouple that growth from environmental degradation. And the private sector has to be part of that journey too. What steps are you taking to engage with the private sector in terms of advancing this sustainable development agenda? And I know in particular, and this is something very interesting, because a lot of your work on sustainable development is decentralized. You're doing it at subnational level. So perhaps if you could tell us a little bit about your efforts at that level too. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you. I'll stick to the 7 minutes. And thank you for inviting the Regional Development Office of my agency, National Economic and Development Authority, to this forum. The Regional Development Office is in charge of supervising what's going on at the administrative region level, and thereby we deal with local government units, the subnational entities. Yes, the Philippine growth story is impressive, but to help ensure that that economic growth is inclusive, the country's medium-term economic blueprint, what we call the Philippine Development Plan 2017-2022, takes into account the SDGs. And in fact, we have SDG indicators which are well incorporated in what we call results matrices. And in an accompanying document to that is what we call the Philippine Investment Program 2017-2022. And part of the financing strategy is to have the private sector come in and finance some of the programs, projects, and activities through public-private partnerships. Basically, we enjoin all the stakeholders to anchor their activities on our long-term vision, which we articulate in a document called Ambisyon Natin 2040. Basically, the vision is by 2040, the Philippines is a country where no one is poor, or where predominantly we consist of the country consists of middle-class families. Now, how does the Philippine government see the role of businesses and civil society in the SDGs? Well, we recognize their importance from building awareness and generating the indicators to actually monitoring them. And in fact, among 22 countries which have submitted voluntary national reviews on the SDGs, the Philippines holds the distinction of being one of only 2 countries, the other being Turkey, that mentioned private sector monitoring and reporting. To inspire the participants here, let me cite 3 examples from monitoring reports. One initiative is Operation Smile. It aims to address issues on dental health, and it uses web and mobile-based application to screen new cases and capture relevant data remotely. Another example is Consulta MD, which allows doctors to provide immediate medical attention via phone calls, and this is particularly important in geographically isolated areas. Another example is Technocart and Batibot. It's a program that delivers to poorly funded kindergartens a Technocart or technology cart, which basically consists of a projector, a laptop for teachers, 20 laptops for students, or student tablets actually, and equipment for internet access. A notable feature of the technology cart is the app based on a popular TV show entitled Batibot. So that's why Technocart and Batibot. Now we are doing an integration of the private sector initiatives basically through 3 major efforts. One is on investment programming, which I mentioned earlier, and PPPs being part of that. Second is on subnational or local government planning. The national government raises awareness of the SDGs at the local government level. We enjoin the local chief executives to include the SDGs as we do the road shows across the archipelago, and we ask them to align their local investment plans with the national plan and the SDGs. Third, on engaging the private sector, we engage them by asking them to align their businesses with the development agenda, and in so doing, they create synergies and innovation is encouraged. Let me cite a good example. In the agriculture sector, businesses like Nestle Philippines, Aboitiz Equity Ventures, and Century Properties are now banking on the growth of local produce, as well as local sourcing of raw materials from poor farming communities. And this push their business agenda forward in line with the SDGs. So those are just a few examples.
I couldn't help myself. I had to look at the PwC app and see how you're faring relative to your peers. And apparently you're faring worse on the following: life on land, climate action, sustainable cities and communities, decent work, and good health and well-being. And it seems that some of the actions that you've just described will deal with some of those goals. I know for a fact that you've led a very interesting process through your Ministry of Finance, a public expenditure review of biodiversity spend, an assessment of the costs to actually achieve SDG 15, Life on Land. And you've worked out that the gap in funding is $350 million a year, and you have a plan by 2020 to close that gap entirely. And already in 1 year, you've closed it by $70 million. And you're doing that with companies. So I think it's really exciting, and I think it's great when you have this sort of data available that you can take action and look at areas that need to be scaled up where perhaps you are lagging. So let's turn to the next example from a country level, Malaysia. Kamariah, you're at the Economic Planning Unit, and so you're at the heart, sitting in the Prime Minister's Department of efforts to land the agenda in Malaysia. Of course, you've got a big subnational issue too, in terms of jurisdiction at state level. What are you doing to work with the private sector?
Thank you so much. Like what was mentioned, Economic Planning Unit is the focal point, a champion for the SDG initiative. And what I want to mention here is that the SDG goals and what we are doing, like right now, is it resonates well with our Malaysian development plans. You see, we have always pursued growth with distribution or equity since the 1950s, and until now, we have managed to reduce absolute poverty from almost 50% to 0.04%, the latest figures that came out. So we are aware that, dealing with the private sector, the challenges are, of course, great because the bottom line is always the profit. But it may not, like was mentioned earlier, it's not the end of a different, it's not the opposite ends, having SDG objectives being achieved and also the bottom line of having a profit being made. So the efforts are numerous, and the challenges are also numerous, taking into account, from the MNCs, SMEs, and the micro companies that exist in Malaysia, whereby 67% of the investment are from private investment, and they provide about 89% of employment. So the role the private sector can play is very vast. So it depends on their innovativeness, and we depend on their creativity to participate. And the government has taken numerous steps to facilitate the growth of the private sector of the industry in the country. For instance, we have also established what do you call it, a productivity nexus for our companies to improve the productivity of the companies, and the government has provided funds for associations to look at ways and means of improving productivity of the companies, and how we can incentivize the companies to come forward and improve on their productivity. And there are also other platforms that we have provided. For instance, besides just the steering committee level, which is set by the Economic Planning Unit, we have engagements and collaborations with the private sector so that we can match our 11th Malaysia Plan to support initiatives to support the SDGs. They come in. We invite the private sectors to see how they can provide to match the objectives. And the other platform is also the interagency planning group. You see, Malaysia, we have the 5-year development plan. Like right now, I'm implementing the 11th Malaysia Plan, 2016 to 2020. So when the SDG was adopted, we have already launched our 11th Malaysia Plan. So we mapped out and see the similarities in the initiatives for the government and also for the private sector to participate. So at this juncture, we are reviewing our 11 Malaysia plan. So there is another platform where the private sector are being called in to discuss how they can improve, how we can facilitate for the businesses to thrive further by having the interagency planning group. And there are also other platform, Transformation National 20. If you have heard that Transformation Transformasi National 50 or TN50, which is ongoing. The Prime Minister himself is the champion of this. And then other initiatives like revising our regulations to improve the ease of doing business. We have the regulatory impact assessment to look at how our regulations may have impacted businesses so that we can improve the ease of doing business. And we look at the ways the companies are coming in to support this initiative. There is this Tun Razak Exchange, which is going to be the financial hub in Malaysia. They have used the latest state-of-the-art of technology, the green initiatives, Khazanah Malaysia, which is also coming in to help us drive the initiative, the goals. But companies, like I mentioned, the micro companies may not have the resources and the capacity probably to drive this. But with the engagement that we have held, because I believe, personally I believe SDG goals is everybody can contribute to it. Even as an individual, you demand for green products, you demand for energy efficient products. Those are among the small contributions that we had. And then the private sectors too, then in the construction sector, we are asking them to go for green buildings, in the construction sector, even for the construction of infrastructure. And the government, for instance, will in 3 years' time make it mandatory for construction to use all the IBS, industrialized building systems, so that it's more efficient and more productive, less wastage on the construction ground. So there are numerous initiatives being undertaken to encourage the companies to participate in this. I mean, it's beyond just the CSR. It's to incorporate the systems in the company to be supportive of SDG.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have other things too, actually. The facilitation fund, for instance, we are providing for the companies for the last mile connectivity, so that they are encouraged to incorporate the goals in their practices.
You're doing a lot of great things. I'm impressed. I mean, but looking at the PwC app, I was surprised because relative to your peers, you seem to be lagging on goal 8, economic growth and jobs. And that's an interesting point. I think maybe it's
I think by the exchange rate that was downgraded the past couple of years.
Right. But your ease of doing business is 24. And this sort of raises a really key issue. I mean, it's something that many countries they would dream to have your ease of doing business. I know you've dropped 1 point, but you're still relatively high compared to your peers. And I know that's been a big focus of government. But for the SDGs, I guess one of the key challenges is how do we get a balance between the ease of doing business and the regulations that are needed to get to this equitable future and to decouple development from environmental degradation. And that's going to be the holy grail. And I think looking forward, I mean, we're going to have to get that right, because if you over-regulate, then you're going to harm your growth prospects. Under-regulate, and you may have a problem on the equity and environmental side. So what is the right balance? And I'll turn now to Bhaskar, Chatterjee, And you're known as the father of corporate social responsibility in India. You've done some really exciting things in terms of moving the goalposts to get companies to invest in sustainable development. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in India, please?
Yes, I'll be happy to do that and try to look at three important points. One, of course, is the fact that India has recently, in the Ease of Doing Business Index of the World Bank, cracked the top 100 for the very first time. We were about 130 a little while ago, and we've cracked the top 100 for the very first time. So that in itself shows a government that is business friendly, that is interested in getting business to work with the government, putting in place a regulatory system that helps business to invest in our country. Also, to look at some of the policies of the government of India. We've had something called Make in India, where we invite foreign direct investment to set up manufacturing establishments. We've had a very strong digitization process. As an IT nation, we have actually impressed the whole world and how strongly we're taking digitization forward. We've looked at, in the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, particularly putting in systems where the number of clearances that were once required to set up a business operation in India exceeded 30 clearances. We brought that down to 12 recently. OECD is still pushing it to lower the bar down to 5. We're hoping to get there soon. The states, you mentioned this, our cooperative and now competitive federalism, is when we're trying to get the states to actually compete against each other in trying to get a business-friendly atmosphere in place. Point number 2 is, in the SDG system, we have the Planning Commission of our nation actually trying to monitor the progress on SDGs. This has been particularly hard because the number of private enterprises in India registered exceed about 1,100,000. And to be able to monitor their contributions on SDG is a tough call. And yet, the business forums, and we have 4 very large national chambers of industry and commerce, and they work very actively with the Finance Ministry and with the Planning Commission in putting forward every single initiative that companies are taking towards furthering the SDGs. If you look at partnerships, this is important from our point of view, whether it's business with business or business with government, public-private partnerships, or you look at business with civil society. And that's worked very well because we recently have this very unique law in India. You spoke about CSR. That's an area where we have asked about 11,000 Indian companies to spend about 2% of their profits on CSR schemes and projects. That helps us to ensure that most of the work on SDGs and CSR are done in partnership with civil society. So there's a very important connect between government and business on the one hand, business and civil society on the other. This also helps us in the other area that this forum is concentrating on, which is metrics. And we're saying to businesses to tell us, and that helps us to review, how much are they actually spending in areas related to SDGs? What kind of projects are they taking up? Which areas of the country are these projects located? So that when we sit down and we prepare a sort of roadmap for the country, we know in which direction, which parts of private sector are headed, which are the SDGs that matter most to them. Because we can't expect business enterprises to target all the 17. So what are they prioritizing? What are they bringing on the table? And how do they link or connect with government initiatives? So there is this very vast network of things we are doing at this point of time, which embrace all the 3 important things. The metrics, how do we work out the numbers? How do we try to track exactly in terms of progress, where we're going? Number 2, and this is vitally important, how do we scale up? Because where we were initially and where we want to be is something that we need to be able to see both the broad and the immediate picture. And finally, in terms of partnerships, whether we actually partner with government or with other businesses or with civil society, those need to be energized at every single level. So putting it all together, in India today, we have this finely tuned machine that looks at every aspect of these, and hopefully by the time we get to 2030, we would have had a very substantial improvement in reaching the SDG goals. One final point, it is said that for the Millennium Development Goals, China was perhaps the most important player. We're trying to look at SDGs and they say, if India does well, the world will do well. And we're hoping the best for India.
I think we all hope the best for India. Well, that's really interesting. And I think there's a story there which I think other countries should look at carefully and look to see how it might be applied. I like the incentive framework that you put in place for investment in responsible development. And I understand there's a tax incentives.
Yes, absolutely. So when you operate through civil society in particular, you get exemptions on tax for the projects that you undertake for the SDGs and for CSR.
Right, so great initiative. Now turning to Bangladesh and Abul, Kasem, you are the president of the Dhaka Chamber of Commerce. You have a membership base of some 4,000 businesses, and that's businesses which are large, businesses that are small, so many different clients with many different needs. What role are you playing working with government to advance the agenda, and what needs to be done to get businesses more actively engaged in the agenda from your perspective?
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me and the Chamber to this important program. We all know the importance of the private sector that needs to play in the SDG goals. And in the context of Bangladesh, about 77% of the GDP is from the private sector, and it is growing at a rate of 7-8% in the country. And SME sector accounts for a major portion of the GDP, and Dhaka Chamber being one of the largest chambers, we have a cross-section of people from SME to large industries. So our role with the government is important. In various areas, we are trying to create the awareness with the government. But here, from a Bangladesh point of view, where we are failing is in the policy design, where I think there has to be more engagement at the policy level, at the policy design level, and at the monitoring level. From Dhaka Chamber, we in the year 2010 envisioned a strategy called Bangladesh 2030, where we kind of targeted Bangladesh to be the 30th largest country by the year 2030. So given that in mind, the Chamber is working within the SDG goals. And in terms of our contribution or our engagement with the government, we are holding various sessions, discussion roundtables, and in fact, we recently signed a MOU with UNDP and organized a Impact Bangladesh Forum to engage the private sector with the government in various areas where we need to enforce. In terms of the government of Bangladesh, they are trying their level best. And in fact, the SEZ law recently came about where we want to create about 100 SEZs by the year 2030. And that would enable a lot of investment into Bangladesh, given that Bangladesh is growing at 7-8%. And job creation would be one of the prime focus of these SEZs. So we see the government is taking action, but there are avenues where we think that there has to be more action from the government to engage the private sector. In terms of infrastructure, I would just like to point out that Bangladesh is currently investing about 2.7% of its GDP in infrastructure, where we are trying to tell the government that this needs to increase up to 5 to 6%. And we see the private sector needs to be engaged in investing in this infrastructure. So where we see that this would be a critical enabler for Bangladesh to reach its SDG goals. I would end here. for the time being.
Okay, so I was very remiss because I should have said and reminded all of you that we expect you to ask questions and send questions through the app. I hope some of you have done just that. Have they? Are there any questions? Thank you. Okay. I have one first. Peter Drucker, the late business management guru, once said, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." And all best strategies die because of culture. So in that context, in Bangladesh, do you think the culture in terms of business engagement is adequate? You have the strategy of engaging with companies, but is it actually working?
In terms of?
In terms of the engagement between you and government.
No, I think there has to be a lot more engagement. There has to be more public-private dialogue systems in place. We have proposed a platform called NIDMA, the National Infrastructure Development Authority, where we are proposing to be chaired by the Honorable Prime Minister of Bangladesh, where the private sector and the public sector are sitting in a discussion on a monthly basis on the areas that needs to improve in the critical areas of infrastructure. So engagement is something that Bangladesh needs to improve, of course. Yes.
What would the answer be in India?
I would say there's a significant improvement. I would say that the engagement with businesses is far more ongoing now. One of the very extraordinary steps that India has taken, which has allowed us to climb up the charts, is the uniform tax regime for the country. The recent goods and services tax policy that we've passed has had a very salutary effect on the system. Very strong move to digitization transactions. So I think as far as India is concerned, the figures speak for themselves.
What about Malaysia and the Philippines?
I would say we have created numerous platforms for engagement with the private sector and also the CSOs. It has improved tremendously over the years, particularly the past decades. Like I mentioned just now, besides the SDG, there is also this interagency planning group. That is for the medium-term planning. But besides that, there are also other councils that being chaired both, at the highest level by the Prime Minister, by the Minister, and also our Chief Secretary to the government, so that in fact, for the Chief Secretary to the government, he is chairing one committee, which is more of public-private, putting them together, to understand how can we to understand what the private sector wants and how can we improve the government services so that it improves the ease of doing business. And there are also now other avenues. For instance, we have already revised the Companies Act 2016 so that the companies on their own voluntarily report to the government how does the business impact on people, employment, and environment. This is something quite new. And then we are at this stage, besides all the engagement, so that we understand what you are referring to SDG, we also now developing the private sector and the economic planning unit and also the UNDP. We are developing a portal so that the private sector can come in and report what they are doing to improve in the implementation of SDG.
And the Philippines?
Okay. I've heard that many times before. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. But should you be discouraged? I think you should not be discouraged. I think you should recalibrate your strategy with culture sensitivity. And the key thing is to understand the culture. Using the Philippine context, let me cite as an example, the autonomous region for Muslim Mindanao. 70+% of households there do not have adequate access to safe water and improved sanitation facilities. And there are many households who do not have bank accounts. And there is a lot of potential for Islamic financing. And the private sector, private firms can engage with the people of the Muslim Mindanao in Islamic financing, even without deep Islamic banking practices, because we only have one Islamic bank in the country. And that is by getting to know the culture there, what will make the people enter into Islamic finance arrangements like profit and loss sharing. You only need to design contracts for that, contracts which are acceptable to the people of Muslim Mindanao.
Well, thank you for that. Meng, do you have a comment on Culture Eat Strategy for Breakfast?
Yeah, I would say that I think that's also where our local network in around 70 countries can provide value to serve as a bridge for public-private partnership. Because indeed, because of language, religious belief, the all different, national context, even within certain large countries itself is very diverse. So we do need really deep local understanding and knowledge about how to, achieve the goals in the most acceptable and efficient way. So I would encourage also, especially multinationals and also SMEs, to utilize the Global Compact networks. And we do have one in Singapore here, and we also have in Malaysia, Philippines, and many other countries in the world. So we want to be a valuable connector for business to contribute in partnership with government for the SDGs.
Oh, thank you. That's very helpful. So I have now a question for Kamariah and for Adoracion. It's from the audience, and it concerns measurement. And the question is, who should own measurement at the national level? Should this be something the government owns and is entirely a government initiative? Or is there scope for other models?
Let me answer first. I think there should be co-ownership between the between the government and the non-government partners. And I think in the case of the Philippines, we're on our way to putting in place measurement frameworks, and we have started something through what we call the SDG Watch. And we are also engaging the private sector to participate in monitoring the indicators, participate in crafting the reports for this. But let us not be too caught up in monitoring, in measuring. I think what we should focus on is doing and actually building partnerships. And my office, given that some private sector firms in the country are a little bit discouraged about how PPPs are at the national level are now being lined up for ODA financing, my office, Regional Development Office of DINEDA, is gonna set up what I call PPP knowledge corners at the sub-national level. The aim is to build partnerships. Of course, we will still be monitoring progress, but we want to focus more of our efforts on building partnerships.
Thank you. And in Malaysia?
At the moment, we are studying this, trying to create measurements for this. But in reality, like it was mentioned just now, we just do it, figure out the measurements later. What is needed is that you make improvement to the existing situation. So, because not all measures like or indicators mentioned in the SDG guidelines, the 240 odd indicators, is not applicable to all nations. I was like, for instance, we have identified 5% or at least 13 of the indicators are not applicable to us. Why? Because, for instance, the central bank was quite ticked off. For instance, the number of ATM machines to population. We do our business online now. We pay online. So the number of ATM machines is not a good indicator. So we, in the process of coming up with better indicators, I think it's an exercise, an ongoing exercise, but we just do it, the other things. We keep implementing the goals.
Thank you. I was going to turn now to India and Bangladesh, but I slightly wanted to rephrase the question, perhaps answer the question, but I'd also like to know, for instance, in India on CSR, what is the measurement system that you've put in place in terms of impact? So your government provides a tax relief, but how does government know that that is warranted? I mean, in terms of what the action is and so on. So what is the measurement? What is the reporting system?
There's something called a national dashboard, which is basically a very simple 8-column framework. Every one of these 11,000 companies needs to report at the end of the year what projects they have taken up, what is the value of each project, where the project is located, what is the duration of that project, and who implemented it. So when we compile this data for all the 11,000 companies, we know how much money was spent. That's key. If you don't know how much was spent, you can never measure the value of the outcome. So in terms of how much was spent, what the outcome was, is evident in the public domain. And we're able to therefore compile very relevant statistics on where the money went, which parts of our country did the money go to. Were these the most disadvantaged sections of the community? Were these the poorest of the poor? Were these geographical areas that cry out for attention? So that kind of mapping actually helps us to look at the micro picture and to allow friends from the media, from civil society. It's in the public domain. That's the most important part.
Well, that's great. That's wonderful. And in Bangladesh?
Well, in Bangladesh, under the Prime Minister's office, there is a SDG coordinating cell, which monitors such activity. And under the 7th five-year plan of Bangladesh, the SDG parameters have been included. In terms of the benchmarking or follow-ups, I'm not very clear on how it's being done. But it is one of the top priorities of the government to monitor the areas where SDG sustainability issues are coming up.
But what do you do in terms of your own chamber, in terms of monitoring the work of businesses?
Yeah,
maybe beyond the SDGs, just in terms of whether it's decent work or other critical comparators, if you like, of sustainability.
Right. With our partnership with UNDP, we have created a data hub where we are engaging companies and following up the sustainable impacts on society. And also, I think after our Impact Bangladesh Forum, about 80 companies have shown interest. So we are trying at a very micro level engagement. But in terms of our macro engagement, we are creating awareness. We have held seminars from infrastructure to blue economy to SEZs. So at the awareness level, we are trying to engage with the government and the private sector. But in terms of monitoring, this is where we need to gear up more and have more information. So there is some lacking, I would say, from where I'm standing.
Right, so we're down to our last 5 minutes, and I have one last question. And we've talked a lot around profit and opportunity, but the converse of that is risk. And it strikes me in Bangladesh that one of the risks you had was around decent work, some of the big stories around the world in terms of what happened in the garment industry and so on. And of course, that can be a big driver of change too. So perhaps for all of the panelists, give a sense of how you're dealing with risk, and of course, how the discussion on risk between the private sector and the government is taking place, starting in Bangladesh.
Well, from the chamber this year, we have proposed to the government to create a R&D and skills fund for the private sector to engage and invest. And in terms of risk management, we want the skills to improve at various levels of the corporate ladder. In terms of Bangladesh, as you know, Bangladesh has limitations in many areas. So we need to create more sustainable processes so that the risk is minimized. In terms of coming back to the R&D's side, what we are trying to tell the government to create for companies to invest in research and development, including skills development, and give tax benefit to this. So it's a long effort, but we are trying.
And in India, is there a conversation around risk between companies and governments?
There is always that, but there is no business without risk.
Right, of course.
And therefore, you can say minimize, but you cannot eliminate risk. Also, businesses in India, I think the perception of government has been that business in India has been very risk averse for a long time. When you look at the investment of capital, you need to have certain elements of risk built into it. You cannot be risk averse and yet, explore the frontiers of business. So what we're trying to do in India is to say that, look, let's have a stable regime of taxation, stable policies, which allow you to chart a course that is predetermined by you with the choices available to you, but you navigate a course in which most of the factors are something that you can take into account now. That allows you to take the risks that you want to take. The other point is, if you do take a risk and you actually do not survive, then you need to bail out quickly. In India, we had this problem because in the status system that we had, if you wanted to close down a company, it took far longer than if you wanted to open it. That law has now changed. And therefore, whereas you can actually now register a company in less than a week, you can also close down in less than 90 days. That used to take up to 3 years before. So from the Ministry of Corporate Affairs and from the Indian Planning Commission point of view, we're trying to say, yes, by all means, take risks. But if you do not succeed or survive, then there are alternatives for you to move on to and to be able to see a stable regime in which you can navigate a decent course.
Okay, Malaysia and Philippines, 30 seconds on risk in the context of coordination with the private sector.
Yeah, I think we have always provided a very stable situation in Malaysia politically, economically, and the policies are pragmatic. The course of action is also fast. When there are certain risks involved, the government will come up with certain instruments or certain policies to counter the risk which may affect the nation as a whole. So it takes prudent evaluation by the companies, actually.
Thank you. Philippines?
We try to strengthen the accountability system, and one notable example is Dial 888. It's a complaint center, and we also try to get more information out there in order to minimize the perception of risk, because there are actually existing incentives, for example, for companies which want to invest in employment of PWDs, those with disabilities. There are incentives out there. There are also incentives for firms which would like to install anti-pollution devices, and there are also incentives for those who want to invest in education infrastructure. So those kinds of information should just be, farmed out there, and the perception of risk can be minimized.
Thank you. Meng, one word?
Yeah, each year that the UN Global Compact, together with our partners, are launching a report called Global Opportunity Report, which unveils the most innovative solutions that looking to solve or contribute to the SDGs by the business. And I can just quickly give one example. That is 3 years ago, that we tapped into a project called Responsible Business and Investment in Conflict-Affected Areas. And according to some very unfortunate statistics, that in 20 years, the people living in poverty, around half of them will be living in conflict-affected area. So business is urgently needing a guideline for them how to operate in such environment. And we convened multi-stakeholder together, including business, to make a guideline for that. So I think through this type of a proactive engagement from business is the best way to mitigate risks.
Thank you, and we've reached the end of the session. I just say, it's been a very interesting conversation. It could have been horribly boring. The whole point around coordination. The fact is, you need coordination, but it needs to be coordinating around specific issues, right? Whether it's the ease of doing business, whether it's around dealing with risk, whether it's around, unlocking barriers to address really sticky problems. And you need to work together on that. So with that, a hand of applause to our panel, please, and thank you very much.